Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Richard McRoberts, Director of Ziptales. We're very excited to have you here and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. We're delighted to have Jane Coy as our presenter today. Jane is an experienced teacher of many years as well as a primary literacy consultant. She's also the author of many educational texts for various publishers. Being a live webinar, you have the option to ask Jane and myself questions live. To do so, use the question chat box to type in any questions you have on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're on our live feed page, use the box below the video screen. All participants will be emailed a PD certificate for attending today. If you're sitting around in a staff room with other staff, make sure you email us a list of all your staff members' names and emails for those who attended. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And Jane, take it away.
Thanks, Richard. Let's start by looking at what is subtext. In literary terms, subtext refers to content within a text that is not specifically stated and needs to be inferred by the reader, the meaning behind the words. To understand the concept of subtext, we need only to reflect on experiences in our daily lives. We've all been in situations where we say things that are not true reflections of how we actually feel, or hear someone saying something that seems inconsistent with their facial expressions and body language. Imagine if simple picture books were given titles that reflect their subtext. For example, the Dr. Seuss classics, Green Eggs and Ham, could be retitled as How Fear of the Unknown Hinders the Development of Informed Opinions. And the Cat in the Hat's new title could be The Virtues of Autonomy, Efficiency and Skepticism. We can compare subtext to an iceberg. The tip is what is actually being stated, but the true meaning is hidden well below the surface. Often the most interesting storylines in the texts we love are those that are just bursting with subtext. Let's look at how subtext links to the Australian curriculum. Learning to infer subtext fosters a number of essential literacy skills as outlined in the Australian curriculum, such as exploring connections between students' own experiences and those of characters in a variety of contexts in literature, sharing key characteristics of the ways authors represent ideas, characters and events, analysing and explaining how language features and simple literary devices contribute to the main purposes of texts and their effects on readers and viewers, and selecting relevant evidence from text to support personal responses and to develop reasoned viewpoints. And that was adapted from the Year 6 Achievement Standard of the Australian Curriculum Document English. Inferring subtext is also a critical thinking skill, which is essential to developing understanding in English. Students are encouraged to be critical thinkers, develop and employ critical thinking and reasoning through close analysis of texts, and that was adapted from the organisation section of the Australian Curriculum English. Let's look at how we can introduce the concept of subtext. The concept of subtext can be a difficult one for students to grasp. Hopefully, they've already had lots of practice developing inferential comprehension skills such as finding the main idea in a text, so that gaining meaning from text by looking at what's not explicitly stated is a relatively familiar one. An effective way of introducing a unit on subtext is to study different types of figurative language, such as idioms, metaphors, and proverbs. They are loaded with subtext and provide a springboard in assisting students to identify the hidden meaning beyond the literal interpretation of the words. So here are some activities we could look at to introduce subtext. You could write examples of idioms or proverbs on separate cards and place them around the classroom. For example, splitting up the idiom blood is thicker than water, or the grass is always greener on the other side. You could place these around the classroom and students then match up the sayings by writing the full version of each one and then come together at the end and discuss the meaning of each. Another activity could be that students locate their own examples of figurative language and use them as clues to a crossword using the last word of the saying as the answer. They could select a theme for the crossword, for example, animals, and take examples of figurative language as the clue would be it's raining cats and the answer would be dogs. or a wolf in sheep's clothing. Another example is the cat that got the, and the answer is cream. Last activity for introducing subtext could be to use the activities on figurative language to introduce the word subtext and explain that it is the underlying meaning behind the actual words in a text. Let's look at identifying subtext in a narrative text. We can guide students to identify subtext in a narrative text by teaching them to understand that authors don't always explicitly tell us what is happening in a story. We instead must make inferences about the underlying messages by analysing three things: the characters, what can we learn about them by what they say, how they act, and how they interact with the other characters; the setting, what are the implications of where a story is set; and the plot development, what themes are embedded in the events as they unfold. Let's first look at analysing the characters. Identifying subtext by analysing the characters means trying to determine what they are really like, how they actually feel according to their true emotional states, and what their motivations are. We can make inferences and judgments about a character by studying their dialogue, their actions, and also the information provided by the author. Let's take a look at how we can study dialogue. When we're attempting to identify the subtext of a character's dialogue, we are looking for underlying characteristics, emotions, or motivations beyond the literal meaning of the words the character's saying. Many characters we encounter in text don't often say what they really mean. For example, in the story Copy Frog, an underlying competitive tension between the main character, Tate, and his classmate Danny comes to the fore when a pet competition is announced at school. Danny sauntered across the schoolyard towards me. He had a smirk on his face. "Pity you won't be entering a pet on Friday." The underlying meaning behind Danny's false sympathy is that he is really thrilled that Tate doesn't own a pet to enter in the competition. This information is confirmed by Danny's facial expression, the smirk on his face. Dialogue also provides an insight into a character's hidden motives. For example, in the movie The Shawshank Redemption, Andy says to Red, "Rita Hayworth, can you get her?" We later discover Andy actually wants a poster of the actress so he can conceal the hole he's digging in his cell wall that ultimately enables his escape. In the story, The Best of Both Worlds, Laura suspects an attraction between her husband and his secretary, Sally. "Sally's very pretty, isn't she?" Mum had said one night after Dad's company's Christmas party. "Is she?" Dad was watching TV. "I hadn't noticed." This interaction displays an underlying subtext revealing the character's real motivations. A perceptive wife worried about the state of her marriage, and a dismissive husband trying to hide his real feelings considering he later moves in with Sally. Another example is found in the story The Open Window. A teenage girl, Vera, is making conversation with a visitor, Frampton Nutter, who has come to stay with her aunt to recover from a nervous breakdown. "Do you know the people around here?" asked the girl, after a long silence. "No one," said Frampton. "Then you know nothing whatsoever about my aunt," said the child. Although these two questions are seemingly innocent, we later realise that they are being specifically used to set up what turns out to be a devious plan by Vera to purposely scare the life out of the poor, unassuming Mr. Nutter. Let's look at some activities of how we can study how dialogue contains subtext. Students could practice answering simple questions in two different ways. The first response is a simple, straightforward answer, and the second response is exactly the same answer but loaded with subtext. For example, the question, "Are you playing netball at lunchtime today?" First response, "No, I'm not playing netball today." Or the second response, loaded with subtext, could be, "No, I'm not playing netball today." You could discuss possible underlying meanings for the way the second response is said. For example, the second response, the underlying meaning, "No, I hate playing netball." Another activity could be to create subtext cards with 4 different phrases written on them. For example, number 1, "I'm in a hurry." Number 2, "I don't like upsetting people." 3, "I can't control my anger." 4, "I'm easygoing." In groups of 4, each student selects a card and role plays an everyday situation. For example, standing in line at the supermarket, or waiting for a bus. And they speak in a way that reflects the subtext card they have received. A final activity for studying subtext in dialogue could be for students to scan familiar texts to locate examples of subtext in the dialogue that they read and create a subtext strip. So the subtext strip would contain information like the title of the story, for example, A Laugh a Day. The character involved, or the character speaking, would be Tim. The dialogue example is, I'm too sick to go to school, as Tim says to his mother in the story. When really the subtext of this dialogue is, I don't want to go to school because I'm being bullied. Let's move on to studying the character's behaviour. How a character behaves gives us valuable information about their personality, feelings, and motivations. Often, a character's behaviour is based on a desire to achieve a certain goal, but this can also reflect an inner need they are trying to fulfil. Harry Potter is a good example. His goal to become a wizard reflects an underlying inner need to connect with his deceased parents, who were also wizards. The subtext of gender roles can also be explored through a character's behaviour in a story. We need only to explore the many fairy tales that feature a helpless princess being rescued by a brave prince. Often, a usually female evil character, such as a stepmother or witch, is thrown in for good measure. So here are some activities we could do with our students to look at how we can study characters' behaviour and the subtext behind it. You could compare the goals and inner needs of characters in popular movies or books. Using a graphic organiser to display the relationship between the character's inner need, the story subtext, and their main goal in the story, such as the example of Harry Potter we just mentioned. Another activity could be to discuss gender stereotyping in traditional fairy tales. How are the male and female characters portrayed? Students could seek out texts where the characters debunk the traditional passive female and heroic male roles. For example, in the movies Tangled and Brave. Another activity for studying characters' behaviour could be for the students to brainstorm a list of popular cartoon characters. They could identify examples of how their favourite character's behaviour gives us an insight into their personality. For example, Lisa Simpson from The Simpsons. Standing in one of the episodes, she stood up for what she believes in by using her role as Little Miss Springfield to speak out against smoking when she realised her title was being sponsored by a cigarette company. Let's move on now to look at how we can study subtext by looking at information provided by the author. Authors can offer us invaluable information about their characters' thoughts, feelings, personality, and motivations, sometimes in just a few words. For example, in the story The Toy Dragon, Mrs. Phillips is walking with her son, Bobby, past a toy shop on their way to a doctor's appointment. Bobby noticed some toys in the window. He had screamed and bawled till she gave in, again. That one word, again, tells us a lot about Mrs. Phillips. Her lack of ability in dealing with her son's tantrums is revealed and leads to an inevitable disastrous ending. Authors also provide information about the values and attitudes of a character. In the story Crash, Amanda dislikes the bus driver, Mr. Crump, because he tells the children off when they play up. Mr. Crump wasn't a parent, he wasn't a teacher, he was just the bus driver. He was supposed to watch the road, not us. Here the author reveals Amanda's attitudes about the role of bus drivers, not to discipline children like a parent or teacher should, but simply drive the bus. Thankfully, she gains respect for the importance of a bus driver's responsibility by the end of the story. Illustrators can also provide insight into a character's true feelings using facial expressions and body language in the pictures they draw. In the graphic classic, Beauty and the Beast, Beauty is telling her father that she will agree to go and live with the Beast. So Beauty says to her father, "Father, I must do what you promised." And despite Beauty reassuring her father she will agree to the bargain he made with the Beast, the illustrator has conveyed her true feelings about the arrangement. So some activities to use to look at how subtext can be provided by the author is to use a graphic organiser Students can identify what the author is explicitly telling us about a particular character and what we know about the character that is inferred. So in the top box you could put, what does the author tell us about the character, with the character's name in the middle, and then underneath, what do we know about this character that is not stated? And then they could compare the two. Another activity could be to use story illustrations as prompts for students to determine a character's inner thought. They could answer the questions, what is the character saying with their words, but what is the character conveying by their facial expressions? And that would incite some great discussion. Another activity for looking at how the author provides information could be to encourage students to be a character detective. They could scan familiar books or online stories for clues about a character's personality that is not actually stated by the author. So you could use a rubric such as this one, where students have to be a character detective. The students could write the title of the book, the name of the character, and then in 3 columns, write down, in the first column you would put which clues the students need to look for, like clues from the dialogue, clues from the character's actions, clues from the author, and also clues from the illustrator. So in the middle column, the students record what clues they can find from those different areas, and then in the last column say, what do these clues tell us about this character? Let's move on to looking at analysing the setting. The setting of a story can also represent underlying messages within a text by how it is described and the role it plays in the development of the plot. In the story, The Black Knight, we can infer subtext from the buildings where the story is set. The first is the house where the newly married couple decide to live. It was a large building, ivy-covered and moss-grown, with climbing roses and jasmine. It was in surprisingly good condition for its age and absurdly cheap. Here the subtext implies that although the house is a wonderful find, the reason it's absurdly cheap is that it was the house where the evil Black Knight lived. Later in the story we read that the Black Knight's body is kept at the front of an altar of a church where his hands are held up in everlasting prayer. Renowned as a fierce and wicked man, the subtext of this chosen setting is that evil can reside even in the most sacred of places. So here are some activities for analysing the setting. You could discuss how settings in traditional stories can reflect underlying messages. For example, the seemingly innocent settings like Grandma's cottage in Little Red Riding Hood and the lolly house in Hansel and Gretel, both reflecting the message that safe-looking places may conceal hidden dangers. Another activity could be for the students to identify movies or books where the setting has been used effectively to reflect subtext. For example, The Ice House in Frozen, reflecting the crippling effect of loneliness and isolation. Another activity could be for the students to explore how the same setting can appear differently depending on perspective. For example, describing a school playground from different perspectives. For example, through the eyes of a child who's being bullied, or a teacher on duty who hates his or her job, through the eyes of an old woman walking past who has no family, or a parent who has a child with a physical disability who can't enjoy the equipment in the playground. Now let's move on to analysing the plot development. Books and movies are packed full of underlying meanings that are weaved into the plot. For example, in the story, Meg's mum can't fly. Meg is embarrassed by her mum, so she runs away. But when her mum searches everywhere for her, she has a revelation. Meg was beginning to think it didn't matter if her mum couldn't win races, bake rocky road squares, and stand on her head. Her mum loved her. Maybe that was enough. The subtext here is that accepting others, even our mums, for who they are, and looking for the positives in people rather than the negatives, gives us a more balanced view of others. Underlying tension or excitement can also be built implicitly into the plot development. In the story Getting Even, a disgruntled student, Simon, starts a business, The Avengers, to help other students at his school take justified revenge on school bullies and the like. It becomes hugely successful, of course. The Avengers were booming. I couldn't keep up with the orders. Revenge was all set to be a major industry. One case blurs into another. Of course, as the plot develops, a perfect storm is forming that ultimately presents Simon with an unexpected downside to his seemingly flawless business plan. Subtext can also be generated in the plot development through dialogue. In the story 3 Wishes, Mr. and Mrs. White are fascinated by a monkey's paw that is being shown to them by a visitor, Sergeant Major Morris. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the Sergeant Major, "a holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow." This ominous message sets up a feeling of anticipatory dread in that although having 3 wishes would be anyone's dream, something is bound to go wrong. So some activities for looking at subtext in plot development could be for students to locate a copy of a narrative-based Dr. Seuss book, for example, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, The Lorax, The Sneetches, etc., and present an oral report describing the subtext of the plot. They could even give it a new title that reflects its subtext, like the ones we used at the beginning of the webinar. Another activity could be to select a plot-based poem, such as A Dog's Mistake or Weary Will by Banjo Patterson, and discuss with students the underlying meanings stemming from the events in the story within the poem. Students could locate their own plot-based poem and analyse its subtext. You could also make a list of common themes found in books and movies, for example, unlikely friendships, altruism, strength of family bonds, caring for animals, etc. Students could select one theme and describe how it has been weaved into the plot of a variety of texts that they have read or viewed. So let's wrap it up. Identifying subtext is such an important skill for students to learn. It helps them think more analytically and critically, and guides them in developing a greater understanding of the underlying meanings of the texts they read and view.